This is a dangerous group that we're dealing with now.
That's right. Check this out.
Go.
Hey everyone, welcome in. I have an interesting one today, as we can see by the title. It starts off a little bit different to as it's described. So it's an hour and a half long, which is a bit shorter than what I've been doing. There and have a look. Well worth the watch. Here we go.
Toddlers on Adderall. History of Big Pharma and the major players will provide insight into this blind spot of historical understanding. In the 1780s, Samuel Crocker began offering dental services. An Anglo-Jewish man from Poland, he settled in England and passed his dental practice on to his family. The Crocker family settled in England and France. English chemist Joseph Bell is credited with creating the first mercury amalgam dental fillings in 1819. Eventually, the Crockers heard of amalgam. In 1833, Samuel's son Moses Crocker moved to New York City, where the Crockers introduced amalgam to the United States. They set up elegant dental parlors in New York, catering to the wealthy with soft, less painful, easy-to-place mercury amalgam dental fillings. Touted as Royal Mineral Succedaneum, their products sold. Similar to them, mercury amalgams today are usually 50% mercury and 50% other metals such as copper, tin, silver, and zinc. They are sometimes falsely referred to as silver fillings. Mercury is used to soften the metal so it can harden into a cavity. While the Crockers enjoyed initial success, the amalgams eventually caused mercury poisoning. They fell out, damaged teeth, and caused more damage than they were supposed to fix. Customers realized they had been conned, and the dentists fled back to France. It was too late. The momentary satisfaction of mercury amalgams, being easier to place and cheaper than gold, spread them around the United States. What ensued was called the First Amalgam War, a pivot point in the history of dentistry from 1840 to 1855. Amalgams created profound division in American dentistry. America's leading dental society, the American Society of Dental Surgeons, created a committee to study them. The committee found them to be, quote, hurtful both to teeth and every part of the mouth, unquote. The society soon declared, quote, the use of amalgam constitutes malpractice, end quote. In 1844, The ASDS decided members must sign a pledge to never use mercury amalgam. As a result, the association was split, and 1856 saw the death of the ASDS and the birth of the American Dental Association out of the pro-amalgam faction of the ASDS. The ADA's support of amalgam continues to this day, and they still dominate American dentistry. The ADA owned patents on amalgam in the mid-20th century, although they did not receive royalties. Some suspect financial interests related to amalgam pulled strings at the ADA since its inception. Despite evidence proving the toxicity of mercury amalgam, it is widely used today. Millions of people have had amalgams in the US, though they are banned or restricted in several countries including Germany, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Mercury amalgams leak significant amounts of mercury vapor, an approximate 15 micrograms daily per filling. Many people have multiple fillings, leaking up to 120 micrograms of mercury into the body every day. The vapor is swallowed with saliva and inhaled into the lungs. Agitating them with chewing or acidic foods can release more. Mercury in seafood is a serious concern, and 1 microgram of mercury is enough to be concerned with. 1 microgram of mercury per gram of fish exceeds the FDA standard. Mercury builds up in the body and damages the regular function of bodily processes. Mercury can cause depression by reducing production of oxytocin in the hypothalamus, being a potent endocrine disruptor. It causes endocrine and hormone disruption, hypothyroidism, which is linked to miscarriages, depression through hormonal imbalance, even DNA damage through alteration of protein structure and inhibition of DNA synthesis. Dimethylmercury, a hypertoxic form of mercury with virtually no applications, is one of the strongest known neurotoxins. Mercury is linked to MS, Alzheimer's, autism, and countless other diseases. Studies have shown pregnant mothers with amalgam fillings pass mercury to the infant, inviting the most severe consequences. Thousands of people who think they have some inherent chemical depression are in fact suffering from mercury poisoning. This 2014 study is titled Evidence Supporting a Link Between Dental Amalgams and Chronic Illness, Fatigue, Depression, Anxiety, and Suicide. This 1994 study is titled Psychometric Evidence that Mercury from Silver Dental Fillings May Be an Etiological Factor in Depression, Excessive Anger, and Anxiety. According to a study found on the FDA's website, quote, part of the toxic effects of mercury, cadmium, lead, etc. are through their replacing essential minerals such as zinc at their sites in enzymes, disabling the necessary enzymatic processes. Mercury disrupts our intake of minerals while inhibiting hormones, keeping us in a constant state of failing health psychologically and physically. Poisoned people look to a wide range of drugs to ease their depression, from SSRI antidepressants to opioids, unaware of a cause. Instead, they could have used selenium to chelate mercury from the body and protect from mercury poisoning or a similar treatment. Today, Henry Schein is the world's largest seller of mercury amalgam. They dominate dentistry, saying on their website, Henry Schein is, quote, the world's largest provider of healthcare products and services to office-based dental, animal health, and medical practitioners, end quote. FDA Commissioner Margaret Hamburg was a board member at Henry Schein before she became the highest regulatory authority at the FDA. Right before she received authority to regulate corporations like Henry Schein or Johnson & Johnson, she worked at Henry Schein. Similar to Michael Taylor, coming to the FDA from Monsanto, Hamburg was an even higher authority. She appointed people directly from Big Pharma to the FDA. Before Henry Schein and the FDA, Hamburg was a health official at the Clinton administration. Hamburg's father was president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Carnegie and Rockefeller are names that should ring a bell as we dive further into the history of pharmaceutical, or allopathic medicine. The story of mercury amalgam is parallel to the story of Big Pharma, the story of pharmaceutical allopathic medicine. Though mercury poisoning continuously results from amalgam, it is still sold, and millions remain oblivious. The word allopathic is synonymous with pharmaceutical. Allopathy was centered around intensive surgeries, chemical treatments, and bloodletting, likely to kill patients faster than the disease itself. The origin of allopathic medicine actually lies in mercury. Patients were purposefully poisoned with mercury, lead, and other toxic metals to, quote, purge the body. Opposite of allopathic medicine is homeopathic or naturopathic medicine. It focuses on herbs, natural substances, and strengthening the body's natural defenses. Some earliest roots of what we call Big Pharma can be traced back to the 1600s. Merck was founded in 1668, and they proudly claim the title of the oldest pharmaceutical company in the world. In 1668, Friedrich Jacob Merck acquired Angel Pharmacy, which later became the Harvard, still owned by the Merck family today. In 1891, Merck in Germany became Merck KGaA, or German Merck, and in New Jersey, a United States subsidiary called Merck and Company Incorporated was established. The vaccine producer Merck and Company today is separate from the original German Merck, but both still operate because after World War I, the United States nationalized and took the subsidiary Merck to become an independent company. Merck and Company holds rights to the name Merck in North America, known as MSD outside of America and Canada, while Merck KGaA in Germany holds rights in the rest of the world. In the 1800s, allopathic medicine largely grew into the big pharma we know today. At the end of the 1800s, industrial powers influenced the culture of American patent medicine and the European chemical industry to explosively grow pharmaceuticals and medical treatment into an industry. In 1830, while mercury amalgam was being introduced to the United States, John K. Smith opened a drugstore in Philadelphia. By 1841, John and his brother George formed John K. Smith and Company. This later culminates into SmithKline in French, and today they are GlaxoSmithKline. GlaxoSmithKline's oldest roots go back to 1715 with the establishment of Plough Court Pharmacy, the predecessor of A&H in London by Sylvanus Bevan. The roots of Glaxo go back to 1873 New Zealand. This is where Joseph Nathan, who left Britain 20 years before, established a general trading company in Wellington, New Zealand. This is called Joseph Nathan and Company, the foundation for what would become Glaxo. Burroughs Wellcome and Company was another convergence of American and British pharma, established in 1880 by Henry Wellcome and Silas Burroughs, American pharmacists who moved to London. Today they are a part of GlaxoSmithKline. SmithKline in French took a central position in 20th century pharmaceuticals, as IG Farben did in Nazi Germany. In World War II, American soldiers were tweaking on amphetamines just as the Nazis were. SmithKline in French amphetamine, sold as Benzedrine, was used by U.S. soldiers as they fought Germans who were on methamphetamine sold as Pervitin by the German company Temmler Pharmaceuticals. Benzedrine inhalers were a first incarnation of American amphetamine. As Shire Pharmaceuticals holds much legal power over amphetamine today, Adderall is the Benzedrine of the 21st century, and Desoxyn, or pill-form methamphetamine, could be considered the Pervitin of today. Older Americans will recall Benny's, the SmithKline amphetamine of their day, a beatnik token as Sandoz's LSD was to 60s counterculture. In 1959, Benzedrine became prescription only. The amphetamine and methamphetamine legally sold today is nearly identical to the last century, and all of that is nearly identical to crystal meth.
Despite all of this history and what should be common sense about corrosive, body and mind degenerating amphetamines, thousands of toddlers, children as young as 3 years old, are legally prescribed them in the United States. As GlaxoSmithKline brought us amphetamine, Bayer actually first patented the name heroin for diacetylmorphine in 1898. Merck was the first major player in the cocaine trade. 1800s America was largely dependent on natural, unpatentable treatments to disease, especially in rural areas. However, this was also an era of patent medicine, often referred to disparagingly as snake oil. Before the chemical heyday of the late 1800s, a few pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer were founded. Pfizer was founded by a German chemist who moved to New York in 1849. Charles Pfizer came from a place that would birth the pharmaceutical and chemical industries as we know them, from the Germanic Swiss heyday of chemistry. Germany and Switzerland could be considered the heart of Big Pharma. Coal tar derivatives and petroleum byproducts were altered and turned into medicine at the end of the 1800s. Some of it could be more accurately called poison. Pharmaceuticals originate from a time when coal tar derivative dyes and drugs were interchangeable. Chemicals in coal tar were altered, turned into both dyes and drugs. In fact, coal tar derivatives are still used in cosmetics and pharmaceuticals today, and toxic coal tar dyes persist today as well. Coal tar was initially considered a filthy, useless industrial waste product, a result of gas production from coal. However, it would become the foundation of European dyestuffs industry, and pharmaceutical drugs would be made from these chemicals. In 1856, 18-year-old William Henry Perkin was trying to synthesize quinine, the anti-malarial drug, when he accidentally created aniline purple dye, later renamed mauve or mauvine. He was experimenting with aniline, one of the chemical components of coal tar, when he discovered that alcohol extracted a purple color from it, which readily dyed silk and was more stable in sunlight than natural purple dyes. He patented mauve, the first synthetic dye, in August 1856, and went to work getting it manufactured on an industrial scale. The success of mauve set off a wave of effort to synthesize other dyes from chemicals in coal tar. This would yield 3 dyes that made Big Pharma what it is today: synthetic alizarin from BASF, as well as synthetic indigo and fuchsin from Bayer. In 1863, Bayer was founded in Wuppertal-Barmen, Germany by businessman Friedrich Bayer and dyer Johann Friedrich Westcott. They figured out how to make fuchsin, purple dye, out of another coal tar derivative. Bayer manufactured dyes until a shift when the European chemical companies expanded into pharmaceuticals in the 1880s and 90s. In the last years of the 1800s, European chemical companies figured out how to make drugs out of their chemicals. In 1898, Bayer began selling patented diacetylmorphine as heroin. Bayer had a major success with aspirin in 1899. Aspirin and heroin were 2 drugs which grew Bayer into what it is today. Bayer aggressively promoted their heroin, a product of boiling opium, as a children's cough medicine, or for adults, claiming it was not addictive. Opium, its alkaloid morphine, and other opiates were a staple of American medicine and medicine all over the world, a classic painkiller as alcohol was considered. And so Bayer presented heroin as a non-addictive alternative to the opiates that dominated the era of patent medicine. BASF was founded by Friedrich Engelhorn in 1865 Germany. Engelhorn, a goldsmith entrepreneur, owned a coal gas company in Mannheim. Observing the success of mauve, he devised a plot to create coal tar dyes. The textile industry's demand allowed them to compete against traditional, more expensive natural dyes in an archetype parallel to the naturopaths versus the allopaths. While coal tar dyes were easily mass-produced, they were more or less toxic. This convenience for toxicity archetype would come to be a major theme in the next century. Berlin professors Karl Graebe and Karl Lieberman collaborated with Heinrich Caro in 1869 to synthesize alizarin, a red dye previously derived from the root of the madder plant. They figured out how to produce it not from the plant, but from a coal tar chemical. Alizarin became BASF's first success. BASF production facilities and sales offices popped up in New York in 1873, near Moscow in 1877, and in France in 1878, largely fueled by the success of synthetic alizarin. From this culture of industrial chemistry, BASF, Bayer, and Hoist arose. The textile industry birthed them out of the demand for industrial dyes. It was this same culture from which the world's largest pharmaceutical corporation today would come, Switzerland's Novartis, a merger between Sandoz and Ciba-Geigy. A note of growth in the Swiss chemical industry occurred in 1859 when Alexander Clavel, Louis Durand, and Etienne Marnus moved to Basel from France to produce synthetic dyes. They created CIBA. Johann Rudolf Geigy Marion, a Basel-based druggist and chemist, was synthesizing and extracting dyes at the same time. By 1970, Geigy's company was integrated into Ciba-Geigy. In the 1880s, businessman Eduard Sandoz and chemist Alfred Kern formed the Kern and Sandoz Company. They were both employees of Ciba. In 1996, Ciba-Geigy and Sandoz merged to create Novartis, the world's largest pharmaceutical corporation. The scope of Novartis's creations throughout history is enormous. Ciba created Ritalin, and Sandoz created LSD. One of the earliest Swiss producers of synthetic drugs was Fritz Hoffmann Laroche, who founded his company in 1896. Synthetic drugs were being produced as early as about 1885 in the region. As the idea to turn waste product chemicals from coal tar into dyes took hold in Europe, supposed drugs and medicines were created out of the same chemical experiments. Of course, there were diligent chemists, incredible minds, and discoveries being made, and some had better intentions than others. But whatever the intention, dangerous and ineffective drugs were also produced, and some persist even to this day. Eventually, the discovery of vitamins, proteins, and other aspects of human health would pave the way for incredible advances in medicine that was in fact scientifically sound, but a good heart was not always the inspiration for advancements in chemistry. Some of the early pharmaceutical drugs were dangerous. Others were not as dangerous yet not so effective, and some were precious gems discovered through years of careful thought and hard work. German druggists paved the way for cocaine as well. After Niemann and Mantegazza isolated cocaine, German Merck became one of the first players in the history of cocaine in the 1880s. In 1883, Merck produced only small amounts of cocaine. By 1885, it produced about 83 kilograms of cocaine a year, importing leaves and later crude cocaine from Peru. It dramatically increased after Dr. Karl Kohler, a colleague of Sigmund Freud, released a report describing the benefit of cocaine for eye surgery to constrict blood vessels. Merck began importing thousands of kilos of crude cocaine to Germany for processing into cocaine hydrochloride by the first few years of the 20th century. The U.S. Surgeon General recommended cocaine to treat depression in 1887, dismissively assuring the public that there was no such thing as cocaine addiction. Sigmund Freud was a cocaine enthusiast who worked with Merck, and he helped popularize it by writing a 70-page report titled Uber Cocaine. A Civil War veteran sowed the seed of Big Pharma with cocaine in the United States. John Pemberton, the pharmacist who created Coca-Cola. Pemberton created many failed drugs, so he decided to fuse the drug cocaine with soda, as soda was a rising trend. Thus, Coca-Cola was born. However, John died in 1888, 2 years after its creation, before Coca-Cola saw success, and Asa Griggs Candler became the sole owner of Coca-Cola in 1891. It was turned into a patent medicine syrup, and then just a beverage. Later, cocaine was taken out of the beverage. Another Civil War veteran is central in this history, Eli Lilly. Eli Lilly enlisted in the Union Army during the American Civil War, became colonel, and was captured, held as a prisoner until the end of the war. After the war, he attempted to run a plantation in Mississippi but failed. His wife passed away, and he returned to his original career as a pharmacist. In 1876, he founded Eli Lilly and Company in Indianapolis, planning to manufacture drugs and wholesale provide them to pharmacies. One of the first medicines he produced was quinine, the same malaria drug which spurred the rise of European dyestuffs industry. He pioneered use of gelatin capsules to hold medicine and fruit flavoring for liquid medicine. Eli Lilly's suggested reforms helped create the FDA in 1906. The concept of a prescription, utilizing the physician's appeal to authority, originated with Eli Lilly. Eli Lilly came to dominate Indiana, and relevant to the history of Big Pharma, Indiana's academic, scientific class came to be dominated by the philosophy of eugenics. Johnson & Johnson was founded in 1886, New Jersey. Their first business was providing bandages and products to railroad workers. They invented the first aid kit and later Band-Aids. A famous household name today, their products contain some of the last chemicals you'd want to accept in your household. Purdue was founded in 1892, New York, as the Purdue Frederick Company on Manhattan's Lower East Side by Dr. John Purdue Gray and George Frederick Bingham. They sold such things as glycerin tonic compound, described as a sherry-based tonic for numerous ills. One can look back at FDA notices from a century ago for misbranded products and start to get a feel for the snake oil of this day, including a similar glycerin tonic compound from 1914 sold by a C.B. Smith & Company. A fairly typical patent medicine type company, Purdue was purchased by the despised Sackler family in the mid-20th century, who to this day reap enormous profits selling hydrocodone, oxycontin, fentanyl, codeine, and more. By the end of the 1800s, powerful industrial players had arose from the ashes of the Industrial Revolution. Patent medicine and European chemistry morphed into a paradigm of pharmaceutical drugs when the industrial titans poured bottomless funds into the creation of entire medical schools, licensing laws, studies, and more. Industrial magnates attempted to crush empiric natural medicine, lobbying for laws that would make the free practice of medicine illegal without a license. Rockefeller even had a hand in the prohibition of alcohol, effectively crushing competition from alcohol-based fuel. The ban on cannabis was a later culmination of these efforts. They criminalized the free practice of medicine itself with licensing laws, licenses mostly given to doctors practicing their allopathic medicine. Corporate philanthropies such as the Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Endowment, and later the Lilly Trust from Eli Lilly steered the paradigm of medicine into the direction they wanted. A turning point was reached with the Flexner Report, which they funded. To understand the origin of pharmaceuticals, we must understand the academic culture and scientific era of the early 20th century. Not only did Rockefeller and Carnegie pay America's most prominent academics to pioneer pharmaceuticals, but their funds were poured into racist eugenic laws and practices. Their brand of science was often voracious, unrelenting, and unsympathetic to the poor, blacks, Native Americans, misunderstood, and disabled. This attitude of cold ambition led to unforgiving condemnation of people considered unproductive or useless. It tainted the scientific academic culture of the early 1900s. One of the only schools praised by the Flexner Report was Indiana University School of Medicine, which was founded under the direction of Dr. William Lowe Bryan. In March 1903, Bryan proposed its creation. William Lowe Bryan was the 10th president of Indiana University, an original organizer of the American Psychological Association, or the APA. Bryan worked with Indiana eugenicist David Starr Jordan to create the very concept of a major to study in college. When you major in a field, you are using the template pioneered by David Starr Jordan and William Lowe Bryan. David Starr Jordan was president of Indiana State University from 1879 to 1891. He would become the first president of Stanford, bringing the eugenics philosophy to California. Indiana State University, tied to Eli Lilly, was a center of American eugenics. Now, what is the meaning of eugenics?
American eugenics refers inter alia to compulsory sterilization laws adopted by over 30 states that led to more than 60,000 sterilizations of disabled individuals. Many of these individuals were sterilized because of a disability. They were mentally disabled or ill, or belonged to socially disadvantaged groups living on the margins of society. American eugenic laws and practices implemented in the first decades of the 20th century influenced the much larger National Socialist Compulsory Sterilization Program, which between 1934 and 1945 led to approximately 350,000 compulsory sterilizations, and was a stepping stone to the Holocaust. Even after the details of the Nazi sterilization program, as well as its role as a precursor to the euthanasia murders, became more widely known after World War II, and which the New York Times had reported on extensively and in great detail even before its implementation in 1934, sterilizations in some American states did not stop. Some states continued to sterilize residents into the 1970s. While Germany has taken important steps to commemorate the horrors of its past, including compulsory sterilization, however, belatedly, the United States arguably has not when it comes to eugenics. For some states, there is still a paucity of reliable studies that show how and where sterilizations occurred. Hospitals, asylums, and other places where sterilizations were performed have so far typically chosen not to document that aspect of their history.
Some earliest roots of American eugenics are found in Indiana. In 1907, the first mandatory sterilization law was passed in the United States to forcibly prevent the reproduction of those people deemed unfit to live. It was the first such law in the world. Along with David Starr Jordan and his ilk, a man who worked with Eli Lilly greatly influenced the passing of this law, Dr. John Hurdy. Dubbed the Hoosier Health Officer, some considered him a heroic, vigilant, tireless crusader for better hygiene and health. Others considered him nosy or intrusive. The poor and disadvantaged, non-whites and misunderstood, would see him as a threat to the continuation of their species.
As seen in the law's explicit statements, those with various degrees of mental disability were targeted for sterilization, though the rural poor often ended up as targets as well. Poor whites from Kentucky and Tennessee were often singled out as disproportionately degenerate as well, especially those living in the back country. These groups were not only outsiders, but had been left behind by the developmental forces sweeping Indiana in the early 20th century. Their social stagnation could easily be characterized as due to innate inferiority compared to the rest of the state. Another group that was targeted by Indiana's sterilization laws were the Ishmaels, a local community who lived in Indiana. In Stern's book, it's mentioned how Oscar McCulloch observed this tribe and concluded they were subhuman, referring to them as devil's grass, since they were burdening the state of Indiana due to their way of living. The studies done on the group known as the Tribe of Ishmael by eugenic researchers helped show society why compulsory sterilization regulation was needed for degenerative families to preserve society and rid them of all defective traits. The Ishmaels were composed of individuals and families from freed or escaped African slaves, Native American tribes, and Europeans who had escaped indentured servitude. It could be that from this diverse mix in the group of Ishmaelites, unique norms and behaviors formed, which were seen as taboo by the rest of society. Ishmaelites wore colorful garments and embraced their norms within their culture, but all these clashed with norms from the lifestyle of mainstream society from that time. McCulloch depicted this group as a, quote, parasitic race with a parapietic lifestyle, unquote.
Blacks, Native people, mixed race groups, the poor, and the disabled were all unfit for reproduction in the eyes of Hertie and his class. In their eyes, they were not human beings, but a burden upon the state to be sterilized and ultimately exterminated, be it through what they called positive eugenics or negative eugenics. This eugenics crusader got his start at Eli Lilly as a pharmacist. The 1906 law mandating the creation of the FDA itself was a law almost word for word identical to a law written by Hertie, as Eli Lilly also influenced the FDA's creation. While hygiene and supposed public health measures were aggressively sought after by David Starr Jordan and Dr. John Hertie, they also gave birth to American eugenics. The actions of these people would lead to the involuntary sterilization of upwards of 60,000 people in the United States all the way into the 1970s. Harvard, Princeton, Indiana University, Indiana State University, Stanford, and other prestigious academic institutions in the U.S. pioneered eugenics. One figure to come from this academic class was the racist eugenicist Madison Grant. He was close friends with several presidents, including Theodore Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover Madison. Grant's book, The Passing of the Great Race, was referred to by Adolf Hitler as his Bible in a fan letter written to him. In the book, Grant first proposes what Hitler would act on, the idea to segregate unfavorable races in ghettos under the guise of charity through the public health system, offering welfare in exchange for their agreement to be sterilized. The dark underbelly of corporate philanthropy and welfare is perfectly exemplified by the philosopher Grant and the regime which put it into action. Not only did the eugenics philosophy originate in America under Rockefeller-Carnegie funds, but the Rockefeller Foundation-funded researchers were literally involved with the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, including David Starr Jordan spread eugenics in California, perhaps influencing Sacramento banker Charles Goeth to found the Eugenics Society of Northern California. Charles Goeth also founded Sacramento State College. President Lyndon B. Johnson affectionately wrote to Goeth on his 90th birthday, even though Goeth successfully lobbied for 20,000 involuntary sterilizations of mostly poor women deemed socially inadequate or feeble-minded by medical authorities. Tens of thousands were sterilized in California under the influence of the Sacramento State founder. While industrial magnates cultivated a demand for their profitable, often pseudoscientific treatments, a true gem of scientific advancement was born, the understanding of vitamins, minerals, and proteins. Polish biochemist Casimir Funk pioneered the theory of vital amines or vitamins. During this time, oil and banking interests sparked the Great War, and Germany's chemical corporations became devoted to the war effort. After Bayer's success with early drugs, heroin, and aspirin, it became more focused on pharmaceuticals and other chemicals. Then it turned toward mustard gas and chemicals of warfare. Bayer director Carl Duisberg enthusiastically worked toward by his own Zyklon B. Haber also pioneered a method of synthesizing ammonia for fertilizer, working with BASF to create the Haber-Bosch process. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the economy suffered as sanctions were imposed. Eventually, under the direction of Carl Duisberg and Carl Bosch, IG Farben Trust was founded in December 1925. It was a trust, or monopoly, which included BASF, Bayer, Hoist, and 3 other corporations. Pharmaceuticals, dyestuffs, explosives, photograph chemicals, and other products were under the domain of this monopoly, which would donate to the rise of Hitler. To illustrate how many chemicals have origin here, the Hoist branch of IG Farben invented methadone, called dolafine, during World War II. They sold it as a cure for opiate addiction, just like heroin. After Hitler's 1932 election, he guaranteed loyal supporters in IG Farben that his regime would support IG's synthetic gasoline production. Hitler started a coal-to-oil program. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Coal Research birthed the process of synthesizing oil from coal, considered the second main node of progress for coal to oil in Germany. Rockefeller's Standard Oil and IG Farben were frequent collaborators, going so far as to merge in a subsidiary called American IG. American IG was directed by Walter C. Teagle, president of Standard Oil of New Jersey. They shared coal-to-oil industrial processes and information, patents and processes that would be essential in making the Nazi war machine formidable. They provided critical info to Germany on how to produce tetraethyl lead and synthetic rubber, cited by U.S. prosecutors in the ultimately ineffective antitrust cases against Standard Oil. After partnering with IG Farben in providing critical support to Nazi Germany, we know Rockefeller's Standard Oil today as Exxon. The industrial powers, oil magnates, chemical, and pharmaceutical interests played central roles in the build-up to World War II, just as oil and banking interests involving Deutsche Bank led to the Great War with the Baghdad Railway concession. It was not just industrial science that was shared between nations, but philosophy. Eugenics is critical to understand in the history of allopathic medicine. The eugenics philosophy was ultimately born in England, matured in the US, and was transplanted into Germany through the academic class. Various Kaiser Wilhelm institutes thrived in Nazi Germany. They could be considered sock puppet academic institutions of the industrial powers. One was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Psychiatry, which featured psychiatrist Dr. Ernst Rudin, who had close ties to American eugenicists. In 1927 Berlin, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics was founded. The Rockefeller Foundation, so influential in the transformation of American medicine, supported both the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Eugenics and the Institute of Psychiatry. The Rockefeller Foundation funded the Eugenics Institute's construction itself, and in great part kept it financially afloat during the Depression. It was one of the first Kaiser institutions. They would culminate into well-funded institutions of eugenics-driven science, which justified human experimentation, slavery, genocide, and racism. Hitler inherited these well-funded institutions when he was elected in 1932 after significant financial support from IG Farben. Ernst Rudin was a prominent European psychiatrist whose associate, Eugene Bleuler, helped coin the term schizophrenia. When schizophrenia was labeled around 1895, eugenicist Alfred Ploetz sowed the seeds of the racial hygiene movement in Germany, inspired by English eugenicists centered in the elite Darwin Galton Huxley family. English psychologist Francis Galton coined the term eugenics in 1883, defined as the science of improving the stock. American eugenicist and Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger had ties to Ernst Rudin, and the eugenicists of Western nations exchanged praise over the years. Other main players in Nazi eugenic institutions include Ottmar Freiherr Verschuer. These institutions created pseudoscientific fields such as psychiatric genetics. Ernst Rudin was made head of the Racial Hygiene Society in Hitler's Germany. In collaboration with SS chief Heinrich Himmler, Rudin and his staff drafted the sterilization laws in Germany, as American medicine men did in 1907 Indiana. By the end of World War II, IG Farben leaders were charged with crimes such as enslavement at the Nuremberg trials. However, by 1952, all 24 of the IG Farben convicts were released, and they went back to high positions at Bayer, BASF, Hoist, German banks, and other positions of power. Karl Wurster was a German chemist and war economy leader during the Nazi reign, to become a leading figure in post-war Germany's industrial life, according to mainstream sources. He was acquitted at Nuremberg and re-established BASF. He was a board member of the Zyklon B producing division of IG during World War II. Wurster worked closely with BASF leader Karl Bosch. After serving no time, he was given awards. He worked with BASF until his death in 1974. He officially retired in 1965, but continued involvement with supervisory boards of several other companies. Fritz Termeer was the chief industrialist responsible for Auschwitz. In 1948, he was convicted of plundering and enslavement, sentenced to just 7 years in prison, but released in 1952. From 1955 to 1964, Fritz Termeer was again chairman of the board of Bayer, and he was on the board of powerful German banks. Despite playing one of the most powerful leadership roles in Auschwitz, Fritz Termeer was involved with Bayer and German banks all the way until the mid-1960s. Countless other IG war criminals served little to no time after the Nuremberg trials, and their influence never really left Bayer, BASF, Hoist, and the German society as a whole. In fact, their influence grew tremendously. Many people are now familiar with the CIA's Operation Paperclip, which brought Nazi scientists to the US, such as NASA's German rocket scientist Werner von Braun. However, few know that war criminals who participated in human experimentation at Auschwitz, such as Kurt Blome, were taken to the US to participate in biological warfare experiments on US citizens. In the 1950s, Operation Sea Spray occurred. San Francisco was sprayed with bacteria by the US Navy as a result of research from Biological Warfare Center Fort Detrick. Kurt Blome, the paperclipped Nazi war criminal, advised biological warfare experts at Fort Detrick, influencing the experimentation on US citizens. San Francisco residents became unknowing guinea pigs of biological warfare, and many became ill. Bacteria was forcefully fed to people in the 1960s via the New York subway system, when military researchers broke light bulbs filled with bacteria onto ventilation grates.
Biological and chemical war. What if the Soviets spread deadly bacteria over highly populated areas, or spray into the air invisible chemicals that can kill thousands on contact? A decision is made in high places. Tests are needed. San Francisco Bay, California, 1950. During 7 days in September, the Army simulates a bacteriological attack on the city. Declassified Army documents reveal that in 6 such attacks, large amounts of bacteria called Serratia marcescens are sprayed towards San Francisco from a small Navy boat in the bay. Carried by the wind, the airborne bacteria spread over a large area. The Army wants to know how far the bacteria can go. These declassified maps of the actual test show the extent of the area that is covered.
The Army decided to do what was called a vulnerability test program. And the effort was over a period of 20 years, actually, between 1949 and 1969, when hundreds of tests were conducted over populated areas to see whether, by spraying germs and certain chemicals, whether they would endanger a large population. And the Army did spray a lot of bacteria around, although they weren't the highly dangerous kind that would be used as an actual weapon. The bacteria that they used did have some health risks.
The invisible attack would probably have gone undetected, but something goes terribly wrong. A few days after, 11 people are admitted to the Stanford Medical Center in San Francisco. They are all suffering from a severe bacterial infection. One of the patients, Ed Nevin, dies.
I was 9 years old in 1950 when he died. My mother was a nurse. She was actually helping to attend to him. And it was a terrible sickness. He was going from high fevers to chills. He had hallucinations. And so it was a very, very serious infection and fever that was causing all that in him.
The Serratia marcescens infection is so unusual to the doctors and scientists at the hospital that 3 of them team up and write a scientific article about it. At the time, the doctors are unaware of the tests the Army had conducted using the same type bacteria just days before. The scientific article is published. The American Medical Association, reaching a scientists reviews the case.
Some months after, they concluded, and this is a very strange conclusion, that the Army's bacteria and the bacteria that caused the infections in the hospital were not of the same strain or the same nature, and that any relationship was apparently coincidental. That was a real stretch.
It takes 25 more years before the story finds its way out into the open.
The Tuskegee syphilis experiments were eugenics-affiliated, racist biological warfare experiments on poor African-American communities in the southern United States. Lasting for 40 entire years, the eugenic theory of blacks being more susceptible to disease was tested by involuntarily exposing African Americans to various diseases, including syphilis. Carefully infected mosquitoes were released on unsuspecting, mostly African American communities in the South during this era, resulting in countless deaths and atrocious illnesses. Once again, the archetype of hegemony disguised as philanthropy reared its ugly head, and under the guise of free medical treatment, they were given STDs and had data collected from them. It was revealed only recently that these experiments extended all the way to Guatemala, where U.S. researchers secretly gave STDs to thousands of Guatemalan people, resulting in more death and disease. Soldiers, prisoners, and mental health patients were experimented on by U.S. researchers led by Dr. John Charles Cutler. Biological chemical experiments on U.S. citizens has a deep history leading up to the present day. Cold, mad science shaped the entire 20th century. It was consistently embedded throughout academia and mainstream science in places all over the world. This culture of industrial mad science laid the foundation for the pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry, and the chemical industry as we know them today. At the same time, underneath the surface of history, the spirit of naturopaths, the empirics, remained consistent in several forms. However, people who questioned particularly harmful advents of allopathic medicine were swept under the rug or subject to persecution. Sometimes, an advancement in medicine that actually benefited people, such as vitamins, was permitted by the establishment. Profit was usually the prime factor. Perhaps it was because vitamins indeed made profits for corporations, such as the one that employed Casimir Funk himself, U.S. Vitamin Corporation. However, intense and effective critics of allopathy were persecuted. In the late 20s, an anti-mercury amalgam movement was spearheaded by German chemist Alfred Stock, but his laboratory and work ended up destroyed. Well summarized by this webpage. Psychiatry is a field embroiled in controversy from its earliest roots. In 1922, Eli Lilly pioneered insulin treatment for diabetics. This is certainly one positive thing they have done. However, it was abused in Rockefeller medicine-style brutal treatment for alleged psychiatric disorders. Dr. Manfred Sackel invented the dangerous procedure of insulin shock therapy for psychiatric patients in 1927, to first be practiced in 1933. It essentially rendered patients brain dead, chemically lobotomizing them through insulin coma and revival when they were near death. It gradually became obsolete in the 50s, while similarly dangerous electroconvulsive therapy or electroshock began to gain prevalence. Both were designed to, quote, kill bad brain cells, in the same vein of 1800s heroic medicine as toxic mercury. Lobotomies were also practiced during this era. Beginning around the 1960s, the various shock therapies were replaced with neuroleptic or psychiatric drugs. Antipsychotics, MAO or SSRI antidepressants, benzodiazepines, and the like were deemed miracle drugs. The first antidepressant is considered to be iproniazid. Iproniazid was introduced into practice in 1958, an MAO inhibitor. In 1964, it was removed from the market in Canada, but not in most other places, despite knowledge of its hepatotoxic effect. Several of the early antidepressants were severely hepatotoxic or damaging to the liver. This excerpt from a medical school tutorial will provide insight into the mainstream medical establishment's way of perceiving antidepressants today. In the post-war era of shock treatment psychiatry, of IG Farben war criminals returning to management positions at Bayer and BASF, unfazed by the Nuremberg trials, polio vaccines came about. The Salk polio vaccine was first manufactured by Eli Lilly in 1955. Its creator, Jonas Salk, earned the respect of Americans with his determined attitude and apparent equality to average Americans, as he injected himself and his own family with his polio vaccine. The concept of inoculation to build immunity against disease goes back centuries, with results varying from apparent success to causing the illness sought to be prevented in the first place. The Salk polio vaccine, however, represented a turning point. Corporations such as American Merck and Company and Eli Lilly entered a new market. Widely cited by vaccination proponents as a success, the truth is more complicated. The Salk polio vaccine did not eradicate the disease, but polio-induced paralysis was renamed AFP, or acute flaccid paralysis. Cases of supposedly unrelated paralysis rose after the introduction of Salk's vaccine, almost as if the formaldehyde added to the vaccines to kill the viruses didn't actually succeed in rendering the viruses harmless. They called it something else and claimed polio had been nearly eradicated. The process of creating the vaccine was complex, involving cells of monkeys, experimenting on animals, and various chemicals and processes alleged to invoke an immune response in people. It was revealed in 1960 that the first polio vaccines all contained SV40, a cancer-causing virus allegedly found in the rhesus monkey kidney cells used to prepare it. Scientists from Merck and Company claim to have discovered cancer-causing viruses in the monkeys used as test subjects to produce the vaccine. Some suspect a consequence of millions trusting the polio vaccine was a surge in cancers among the baby boomer generation.
The modern era of medicine featured both genuine science and pseudoscientific dangers. This era brought the world psychiatric drugs, modern vaccines, biotechnology and genetic modification, and new medical equipment. Advances were made in understanding proteins and DNA, vitamins and minerals, and much more. The complexity of the modern era in medicine is too much for this documentary. Here, we will attempt to provide a framework which can serve as a starting point to your own research. In 1945, Grand Rapids, Michigan became the first city in the world to put fluoride into its water supply. The effort was pushed by NIH dental hygiene man H. Trendley Dean, inspired by research produced by Frederick Mackay in the early 20th century. The U.S. Surgeon General sponsored fluoridation. While Mackay's research mostly focused on the harmful effects of fluoride, his observation that it made teeth harder while turning them brown was enough to encourage Dean. Fluoridation is a textbook case of involuntary treatment. The original fluoride researcher Mackay was trying to learn why certain U.S. towns had residents with brown-stained teeth. His research brought him to the corporation town of Bauxite, Arkansas, where the aluminum industry's byproduct fluoride was contaminating water and turning teeth brown. He observed that just 5 miles outside of the corporation town, teeth were better. The town Bauxite was owned by the Aluminum Company of America, or ALCOA. When word reached the ALCOA's chief chemist H.B. Churchill in Pennsylvania, he furiously sought to refute claims that his industrial byproduct fluoride was harmful. The aluminum industry has always been tied to fluoride. Further, the father of propaganda was directly involved. By 1960, allopathy was about as obscene as it ever was. Methylphenidate, or Ritalin, then called MPH, was first synthesized in 1944, and SIBA began to sell it in the 50s. Amphetamines were so freely consumed at this time, a patent medicine-style tonic of MPH, hormones, and vitamins marketed to improve mood and maintain vitality was sold as well. Just as smoking crystal meth is not a very healthy way to improve mood and maintain vitality, neither are amphetamine or MPH. According to the medical industry, anxiety was a widely reported problem in the 1950s and 60s. In the next several decades, depression became a central focus of drugs and psychiatry. Circumstances and the struggles of life surely can be considered a primary cause for anxiety or depression. However, anxiety and depression are exacerbated by chemicals. Toxins, endocrine and hormone disrupting chemicals, and malnutrition are legitimate causes to what is misleadingly called chemical depression. Mainstream psychiatry tends to ignore the toxicity factor of depression. They sort of avoid investigating the cause of what they call a chemical imbalance, as if it is some inherent causeless problem. Mercury poisoning was common in the heavy coal burning era. People exposed to coal could become mercury poisoned, and mercury from coal persists in the environment today. Industrial chemicals agitated depression and anxiety. Symptoms arose that seemed chemical and not circumstantial. Milltown was an early psychiatric drug, considered one of the most popular drugs in U.S. history. It was prescribed heavily to treat anxiety in the 1950s. By 1965, 500 million prescriptions had been written. A staple benzodiazepine called Librium became more popular after that. Milltown was called a tranquilizer. In the late 1970s, public opposition to dangerous pharmaceuticals threatened profits. Tranquilizers, benzos, tricyclics, and MAOIs were broadly referred to as anxiolytic drugs. Remarketing similar drugs as antidepressants helped solve the PR problem. Sandoz discovered LSD in 1938. In 1949, Sandoz brought it to the US, and psychiatry got a hold of it. Mainstream American media popularized it, along with the CIA. Apparently thinking LSD could help render people malleable and docile, the CIA abused people with LSD in horrific MKUltra experiments. Most info about MKUltra has been destroyed or is unavailable to the public, but what we do know says a lot. One chemist lost his life after getting too close. In this era of biological warfare experiments on Americans, people were involuntarily dosed with LSD. Sandoz either knowingly or unknowingly provided LSD for human experimentation. Although psychedelics such as psilocybin, mescaline, LSD, and DMT are known to have benefits for introspection, dissolving walls of ego, or coming to peace with death, the CIA and friends single-handedly popularized them. To those with a lust for power, they apparently looked like a useful tool. Chase Bank Public Relations Vice President Gordon Wasson almost single-handedly popularized psilocybin mushrooms by writing a 1957 Life magazine volume about his experience with them on an expedition to Mexico. FOIA documents revealed his 1956 expedition was funded by the CIA, part of MKUltra's Subproject 58. As you'll remember, biotech, pesticide, and chemical corporations are conjoined with Big Pharma. They have always worked together and still do today. Eli Lilly was a first player in genetic modification, working with America's first biotech company, Genentech. Genentech's rDNA technology was used by Eli Lilly to make human insulin. They genetically modified bacteria to produce insulin for diabetics instead of using thousands of pancreas glands from animals. This is certainly a more positive example of biotechnology. From about 1961 to 1971, Monsanto's Agent Orange pesticide was used by the US military to defoliate Vietnam, leading to horrific birth defects and consequences resounding to this very day. As SmithKline Benzedrine was America's amphetamine of choice in World War II, an even stronger form of it produced by the same company was provided to US soldiers in Vietnam. Drug abuse in Vietnam was ignored or even encouraged. Soldiers were coerced into using drugs to suppress conscience, moral difficulty following orders to use violence, and ignore symptoms of PTSD. They were encouraged to abuse drugs from Benzedrine to psych drug Thorazine to opiates and benzos. In 1985, Monsanto purchased Pharma Corporation Searly, lining the pockets of Donald Rumsfeld. Searly created such things as the artificial sweetener aspartame and the first birth control, produced from the work of eugenicist Margaret Sanger. Though aspartame was rejected by the FDA multiple times, known to be toxic, ex-Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld held political power as the CEO of Searly. He pushed for the approval of aspartame despite the fact that it literally turns to formaldehyde and methanol in the body. Rumsfeld became Secretary of Defense for the second time in the Bush administration, participating in the invasion of Iraq, torture, war crimes, and worse. From 1973 to 1991, incidence of childhood cancer of all types in the U.S. increased 10%. Well summarized by Amy D. Kyle.
In 1996, the National Cancer Institute reported that the frequency for cancer of all types in children had increased 10% between 1973 and 1991. This means that 10% more new cases of cancers per million children were found in 1991 than in 1973. During this period, brain cancer and soft tissue sarcoma had increased more than 25%.
A whole generation of women with increased rates of cancer was dubbed the DES daughters. because their mothers had trusted a highly carcinogenic drug called diethylstilbestrol during pregnancy. The DES daughters of our day are victims of Gardasil, the HPV vaccine known for countless cases of cancer, cervical cysts, infertility, and even sudden death. In 1971, the National Cancer Program was established in response, pouring government funds into chemotherapy and profitable pseudoscientific treatments, while naturopathy was suppressed. It is widely debated whether cancer is generally rising or not today. Skeptics say rates have remained flat, and others cite things such as this 2012 WHO report claiming global cancer rates will rise 57% from 2012 to 2032. The WHO report claims it will rise from 14 million new cases annually in 2012 to 22 million in 2 decades. They claim cancer rates will rise from 8.2 million a year to 13 million. However, the World Health Organization is known for a spectrum of falsehoods, from alarmism to completely ignoring legitimate issues. Mainstream science cites aging populations as the cause of rising cancer rates, as if the elderly inevitably get cancer. They cite random mutations as causes to cancer, as if carcinogens aren't the primary factor. They like to avoid talk of poison. In the 1980s, AIDS and certain autoimmune disorders became a central focus in mainstream medical science. Autism spectrum disorders began to rise in the 80s and 90s. People had become normalized to psychiatric drugs, and consequences of trusting certain chemicals came home to roost. The idea that autism isn't rising and it is simply recognized now is patently false. Drugs originally popularized by Merck, SmithKline and French, and Bayer became a central problem for the common people as the crack cocaine boom of the 1980s and similar drug epidemics entered a new era. Gems of true scientific advancement were uncovered still, even more rapidly, but they were a rarity scattered throughout a maze of profitable medicine. Infant cancer rose in the 80s and 90s in a dramatic 36% increase. In the 1990s, obnoxious television ads for drugs clogged the minds of a poisoned public. Children normalized to drugs and chemicals were increasingly given Ritalin, Adderall, and psych drugs until the present day, when concern for chemicals has deteriorated so far that toddlers are allowed to consume amphetamine. The consequence of trusting chemicals had hit fully. The consequence of people not steering their communities voluntarily in the direction they wanted allowed powerful people to steer society in a direction that did not benefit the people. Allowing powers to influence our trajectory brought us to where we are today. However, fate has brought us the internet and all the information we need to make a better world for our children, if only we use our resources wisely and put in the effort. The 2000s to present day era of Big Pharma is too much for this documentary, but this should serve as a starting point to your own research. So why don't more people speak out about poison today? Why is all of this history ignored? A hegemonic complex, not one massive conspiracy necessarily, but a complex of unsavvy individuals and hegemonic structures with all of their individual and collective agendas between corporations and government, academia and mainstream media suppresses this info. It is a structure of mutual interests. Warring factions of elitists exist. Nothing is black and white. The bottom line is no power players really care about the bottom class. The FDA, ADA, CDC, NIH, WHO, and other government organizations are in with Big Pharma. Lobbying groups, or quote, advocacy organizations, such as the Center for American Progress or Podesta Group hold power, just to name a few. Regulatory authorities crush naturopathic medicine and use the force of government against unlicensed practitioners of medicine, just as they did at the turn of the 20th century. They claim to be looking out for our safety and persecuting people selling vitamins and minerals, raiding businesses with government thugs, It's the classic archetype of hegemony disguised as philanthropy. Ex-FDA Commissioner Margaret Hamburg is a microcosm of the power structure. Her father is President Emeritus of Carnegie Corporation of New York, Andrew Carnegie being one of the industrial titans who made Big Pharma what it is today. She was a board member at Mercury Amalgam producing Henry Schein and was caught up in a racketeering scandal making profits for Johnson & Johnson, which her husband's hedge fund owns stake in. Her parents were both leaders in the American Eugenics Society, which at the time was renamed the Society for the Study of Social Biology, and is today called the Society of Biodemography and Social Biology. As eugenicist Frederick Osborne famously said, eugenic goals are most likely to be attained under another name than eugenics. Eugenics survives today under the term bioethics. This is how power works. It is a game of getting into an office of power and exploiting it to the fullest to make as much money as a person can while staying as far off the radar as possible. The medical schools, from the days of the Flexner Report to now, support Big Pharma. The current FDA commissioner has been directly paid by Big Pharma for years, Robert Califf. There exists insidious guidelines and regulatory structures, things such as Codex Alimentarius produced from the culture of Bayer and BASF-controlled Germany. They are tools of coercion, inching towards using the force of government to feed us allopathy. Such things as irradiated fruit, destroying the DNA of fruit we eat to supposedly kill bacteria, or genetically modified crops, are permitted by Codex Alimentarius, while vitamins and minerals and business operating outside the tentacles of government are persecuted. Codex Alimentarius is alleged to be voluntary, a set of regulatory guidelines on food and drugs that are mere suggestions for government. However, each day we are marched further toward coercion, and guidelines like these become mandatory. What they really want is the ability to coerce people into using allopathy forcefully. They want to use the force of government to crush naturopathy and basic freedom, and they will march us toward that with every energy the power structure has unless we fight it with everything we have. Where help is actually needed by the regulatory authorities or false philanthropies, they are nowhere to be found. Flint, Michigan residents have been poisoned with lead and other serious toxins in their drinking water. While authorities tried to cover up the problem, real people from community activist group New Era Detroit went to Flint and handed out over 1 million bottles of water. New Era Detroit has gone to Flint multiple times, providing truckloads of water, food, and love to the people of Flint. Flint residents are still dealing with poisoned water. Governments are not our friend and historically never have been. In league with Big Pharma, with the chemical corporations, they will dissolve any shred of freedom we have left and mandate that we use toxic products. This is not a right-wing or left-wing issue. As Margaret Hamburg was a health official in the Clinton administration, the right is just as in with Big Pharma. Senator Orrin Hatch is deeply connected to pharma, even though he defended kratom when the DEA tried to ban the medicinal herb in 2016. He pretends to be a hero for natural supplements and herbs, but is actually paid by Big Pharma. Kratom is a pain-killing herb that was targeted by the DEA in 2016, but the people who use it as an alternative to pharmaceutical opioids, the alternative media, and the modern-day incarnation of the spirit of the naturopaths, managed to stop it from being banned. Researchers uncovered that the medicinal value of kratom was known as far back as 1964, when SmithKline and French patented a kratom alkaloid, contradicting DEA claims that it had no medicinal value. This is the same DEA that recently declared medicinal CBD as a Schedule I illegal substance, the same DEA embroiled in a scandal with drug cartel-supplied prostitutes in Colombia. The great solution to health problems is simply nutrition, mindfulness about how the body works, and outright refusal to ingest carcinogenic chemicals found in food. The solution lies in refusing toxic metals found in amalgam dental fillings or vaccine adjuvants and ensuring we have the nutrients and minerals our bodies need to function. Our bodies need minerals such as magnesium and selenium so bad that when we are deprived of these minerals, the body tries to use toxic mercury. One great healing plant is cannabis. Cannabis oil is known to cure epileptic seizures, while the medical industry to this day instead chooses to cut heads open in treating epileptic seizures. Epilepsy is known to be caused in the first place by anesthesia. Haley Willer's story is a perfect microcosm of naturopathy versus allopathy. Reading from an article we published at Era of Wisdom. In 2010, Haley Willer was one of the first young girls to receive the HPV vaccine Gardasil. She was very physically active, a competitive figure skater for most of her life. Within a couple weeks of receiving Gardasil, she started to feel, quote, not herself, as described by her mother Dana. For the next few years, she suffered severe migraines, ovarian cysts, an incapacitated immune system, anxiety, and other symptoms commonly reported by victims of Gardasil. In 2013, she was diagnosed with leukemia. As countless people have been victims of, quote, sudden death after receiving this vaccine, as people such as Chase Topperwine have been afflicted with this specific type of cancer after Gardasil, Haley became a victim as well, until her mother discovered cannabis oil. Her mother began to research and discovered countless other cases of ovarian cysts, autoimmune disorders, cancers. From Dana knew to treat her daughter with cannabis oil, they went the chemo route. She says her daughter had, quote, every side effect imaginable from the chemo. Her hair fell out, sores appeared in her mouth that made drinking and eating problematic. She had fevers for up to 10 days straight, and she became hypersensitive to everything. The symptoms of Gardasil injuries and chemo mixed together to create a catastrophe of symptoms. She was pumped full of steroids in response. Dana decided to make cannabis oil for her daughter herself. Within 1 week of treatment, about 7 months into chemo, her routine blood work came back normal for once. Before that, the blood tests were consistently erratic. Haley's health improved to the point where 2 months into cannabis oil treatment, she decided to completely abandon chemo. The cancer never came back, and it was thanks to her decision to defy the advice of medical professionals. Aluminum and mercury adjuvants added to vaccines are one culprit for how vaccine damage occurs. Victims of vaccine injury find help in chelating mercury from the body or using silica from things such as diatomaceous earth to remove aluminum from the body. Though with our free will, we can choose what we consider the right path ourselves. Governments in league with corporations want to erode our right to decide what constitutes good health. The 21st Century Cures Act was signed into law in the U.S. on December 13, 2000. Lobbyists representing Big Pharma. It is being called an overhaul of the FDA and will allow drugs to be approved for sale much quicker than before, with much looser requirements for testing them. It also pours funds into allegedly combating opioid addiction, but the medical establishment literally prescribes stronger opioids to, quote, combat opioids, while ignoring kratom. So we will probably see more of this. Mandatory vaccination is something we will have to push back against. Forced to decide what parents should do, mandating that children have, quote, the right to form healthy attachments with adults responsible for their care and well-being, and the right to appropriate quality health care, unquote. Richard Pan, a California state senator from Sacramento, is another pharma player, also the co-author of California's previous mandatory vaccination law for children attending school, Senate Bill 277. When opponents of SB 277 failed to stop it, Pan gloated that it was a, quote, victory of science over the politics of fear and intimidation. claiming opponents of mandatory vaccination, quote, used fear, intimidation, and discredited information to try to defeat our bill, end quote. This ignores all the deaths from HPV vaccine Gardasil and all the other various incidents of vaccine injury. One can find pages upon pages of documented deaths from Gardasil and VAERS vaccine injury reports. Pan surely knows this, and to advance his agenda, he is willing to use the force of government to push vaccines with adjuvants that cause injury regardless. No power has the right to use force against people for choosing a different type of medicine. State-sanctioned mandatory vaccines in China have already been responsible for injuries and deaths. The documentary Vaxxed examined vaccine injuries, the link between autism and Merck's MMR vaccine, and the CDC cover-up of it all, resulting in the persecution of Andrew Wakefield.
We could cut the number of children who die every year from about 9 million to half of that if we have success on it. And the benefits there in terms of reducing sickness, reducing the population growth, it really allows the society a chance to take care of itself once you've made that intervention.
There's been a lot of scrutiny of vaccines recently, specifically childhood vaccines. There's been a lot of news about, is there a connection with autism, for example? What do you make of all that? Dr. Wakefield wrote a paper about this saying that he thought there was a connection. And there was lower vaccination rates as a result for a period of time in Britain than the United States. What are your thoughts?
Well, Dr. Wakefield has been shown used absolutely fraudulent data. He had a financial interest in some lawsuits. He created a fake paper. The journal allowed it to run. All the other studies were done, showed no connection whatsoever, again and again and again.
The mainstream media targeted Wakefield while ignoring the actual victims, who clearly explained their children became damaged immediately after receiving the vaccine. It shouldn't be difficult to see the connection if you talk to the parents. The mainstream voraciously attacks critics of vaccination. Their response bears all the traits of social engineering, similar to how the term, quote, fake news suddenly appeared throughout mainstream media at the end of 2016. Vaccines are required to enter certain countries. B17 and cannabis are banned, and pharma corporations have the audacity to profit from forced medication in the U.S. prison system. U.S. prisoners have been experimented on by researchers on and off for decades, as documented in the book Acres of Skin. They are routinely forcibly drugged with psychiatric medications today, and some commit suicide. Reading from an Era of Wisdom article, in 2008, a man named Michael Heston hung himself in incarceration at Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota, after being forced to endure injections of psych meds involuntarily on a regular basis. He wrote to a medical freedom advocacy group called Mind Freedom, begging for help, saying, quote, I live in mortal fear, and the needle has me terrified. They just keep sticking me every 2 weeks and I feel like death, end quote. Although the good people at Mind Freedom sent out a public request for help to assist him, the pain of this strange drug would eventually drive him to suicide, as certain psych meds, including SSRI antidepressants, have been known to do. If you think it couldn't get any worse, look up at the sky. What is this haze that wasn't seen several decades ago? Why are high-altitude planes leaving behind trails that expand without end and create a haze in the sky? Although the government wouldn't dare admit it, the free-form aluminum being found in rain tests in bees and throughout the environment is understood to be coming from geoengineering. Harvard figures such as David Keith, and now the CIA director himself, are openly proposing that aerosol mainly composed of aluminum be sprayed out of airplanes in the sky to, quote, combat global warming, as if it isn't already happening. Our prediction is that soon the US government will declare we are going to commence geoengineering, and they will openly spray to allegedly combat global warming. Those who pay attention already understand that this is happening. In 2012, the president of Iran boldly came out against geoengineering, explaining how the clouds move from west to east in Iran, and so weather modification technology from the west of Iran is being used to take rain from Iran's clouds. That is basically a description of how aerosol works to keep rain from falling. As Iran is in the worst drought of their history, in the proper historical context, we see Mahmoud Ahmadinejad could be telling the truth. West of Iran, chemtrails have been filmed in Turkey. Some can recognize the smell of it in the air. Sharp, metallic, sometimes starchy, plastic, kind of like a plastic slide at a playground or the smell of a hospital. Rain tests from California Laboratory Services, courtesy of Stop Spraying Us San Francisco, show almost 100 times the reporting limit of aluminum in Sacramento, California rainwater. In the same period of time these photos were taken, matching geoengineering patents. 4,700 micrograms per liter of aluminum cannot simply appear out of nowhere. A physicist with a PhD in nuclear chemistry, J. Marvin Herndon, wrote a paper about the possibility of coal fly ash being the base material for much of what is sprayed, as coal fly ash is similar to the signature metals being found in rain tests. The journal retracted it with little explanation. As always, mainstream science does not permit dissenting opinion. If it wasn't about censorship, mainstream science would exude a much less bitter attitude. Even further, if the US government is allowed to spray aerosolized aluminum in the stratosphere, or if they are allowed to spray Miami with pesticide to combat an overly hyped Zika virus, they can covertly spray anything on us. What is stopping them from spraying bacteria or some biowarfare agent on us while we're not even mindful enough to notice our skies being hazed out? In the proper historical context, we know this is a serious possibility. It's even more viable a possibility when you understand a new biowarfare facility is being built in Kansas, titled the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility. The core truth is this beautiful world tainted with psychopathy and coercion never became more harmless. However, with hard work and clarity, constantly reevaluating and changing our opinions of how the world works with mindfulness and humbleness, we can create the communities we want to live in, voluntarily, without the coercion of government or the help of allegedly philanthropic corporate powers. The spirit of naturopaths survives in organizations such as March Against Monsanto. Where help is needed in understanding carcinogens, March Against Monsanto is there. While they are denigrated as conspiracy theorists, the good people at vaccine injury websites are helping people. Where Michigan residents need fresh water, community organization New Era Detroit is there. Agorism is the philosophy. It is the philosophy of solutions, of the common people working in our communities to provide for each other and operate outside of the system. It is not right or left wing, but simply about supporting our fellow people economically and socially. We can invest in our own people and use an independent currency from the dollar, buy necessities from our people instead of buying food from a Walmart. We can stop relying on the government for what a strong community should provide. The next Era of Wisdom documentary will be about the philosophy of solutions, building our own structures of society outside of the system, and truly creating a better world for our class of people.
So there we have it. For the first time in quite a while, we actually made it to the end of a show live. I'm a little bit happy about that. So I'm going to leave this one public, as I've just said in chat. Excuse me. I would not appreciate it, but I would share that out while you can. I'll post the original in the Telegram chat, as always, and see how we go. If I disappear, find me on the backups. Come find me a lot. Oh shit. Alright guys, thank you. We'll see you all later.